Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5. I am your host, curator with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, Kevin Adkisson, and I am here today in one of our favorite spots on campus, the Cranbrook Collections Wing. Of course, the collection wings houses much of the permanent collection of Cranbrook Art Museum, as well as important cultural properties from the 14 different cultural properties collections. And if it has felt like, as painful as it has to all of my family, I've been doing less Live at 5s, that is because I have been super busy, along with all of our small but mighty center team, along with some additional volunteer leaders like Beth Willoughby and Dick Lilly and Anna Merzda, working on the center's annual fundraiser, which is this Saturday, May 22nd, 2021. It has taken up quite a bit of our time and mental space, and if you've been following along with the center on Facebook and Instagram or getting our emails, you know that the evening on Saturday night is going to celebrate all things Cranbrook and Swedish, with a real focus on the legacy and work of Carl Milles. Now, we have here at Live at 5 done quite a bit of work with Carl Milles. So if I say that name and you don't know who it is, that's okay, but I encourage you to scroll back in time. I've done tours here on Facebook Live at 5 of Carl Milles's outdoor sculpture around the Art Museum, his sculptures around Academy Way, as well as his house on Academy Way. If there's enough Carl Milles to make multiple Live at 5s, you know he has to be pretty important, and he is really integral to the story of Cranbrook. Carl Milles was born in Sweden. He trained to be a cabinet maker, was pretty unhappy, went off to Chile to open a Swedish gymnasium, or help open a Swedish gymnasium, but en route to South America, he stopped in Paris and never went any further. He ended up studying with Auguste Rodin, and his early artistic inclinations were perfected into a real sort of artistic genius. After a number of years in Paris, he married Olga Graner, and she became Olga Milles, and the Milleses returned to Stockholm, where he began to build up his career as a monumental sculptor. Now, he came to Cranbrook in 1931, and I need you to sign up for a global house party at Cranbrook and Milles Garden to hear more of the story of how he ended up leaving at sort of the height of his fame, Stockholm for Cranbrook. But part of that journey here was a purchase in 1934 of many hundreds of thousands of dollars of Carl Milles's works. Over 60 pieces were purchased at once in bulk by the Cranbrook Foundation, and those are the pieces that you know and love around campus. But today, I thought it would be interesting if, instead of doing another outdoor Carl Milles sculpture, which we've done here at Live at 5, and after this broadcast ends, you can go back in time and watch it, I thought today it would be fun to come into the collections wing and to see some of the Carl Milles sculptures that we keep here in storage. So we've done some other collections wing tours before. We've looked at the paintings of Zoltan Szepesi, we've looked at furniture, we've looked at tapestries and hangings by May Morris, but today we are going to stick here in Unit B4 and Unit B3 and study some of Carl Milles's sculptures that are not on campus, on permanent display, but are kept here in the collections wing. And we'll talk a little bit about why some of these sculptures, even though they're quite large, are kept here in storage and not on permanent display. Now, we'll begin our short little dive into Milles in the collections wing with this beautiful piece that was purchased by Cranbrook by the former director of the Art Museum, current director of the center, Greg Whitkop, in 1992. It was purchased at auction, and it is the oldest piece by Carl Milles that we have at Cranbrook. It's called The Struggle for Existence. I needed to get the name of this piece for our documentary film, and I sent a message on Microsoft Teams over to the registrar, Leslie Mayo. It was probably 7 a.m., and I said, Leslie, what's the name of that piece that we filmed in the house? And she replied, Struggle for Existence. And I said, I know we're all really stressed, but what's the name of the piece? Turns out this is The Struggle for Existence, so it could be a portrait of the center staff as we go into the fundraiser. And you can really tell that the piece is done in the style of Auguste Rodin. If you don't know the works of Rodin as well, you certainly know his Thinker that is located in front of the Detroit Institute of Art. Also, many copies of The Thinker. There's one in front of the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, and of course, Rodin's museum in Philadelphia and in France. And so it really has this very 19th century feel to it. It was sculpted between 1899 and 1900. And it is signed by Carl Milles, and if you study all of his signatures that you can see, if you come to campus right now and take a walk, it would be a fun thing to do to search for how he signed his sculptures, but I would say 75% of the bronzes on campus are signed by both Milles and Herman Bergman, who did the casting. This was cast by Andro Fondier in Paris, who did cast of many sculptors' work in Paris. What's interesting about this early piece is that about 1917, 1918, Carl Milles decided everything he had done was terrible, and he shoved it off the cliff of his home outside of Stockholm. So you'll see on Saturday night when you sign up for our global house party at Cranbrook and Milles Garden, you'll see in the documentary film that we have made beautiful footage of Milles Garden, and it is really right there in the harbor, and there's a huge cliff. And so the story goes that Milles looked about him, looked at his work, and said, nothing I've done is worthwhile. I am entering a new phase, and he shoved everything off the cliff. I don't know how true that is. I don't know how many things he actually threw off, but we are lucky to have at Cranbrook this later purchase of The Struggle of Existence to show the artist's early work. Now, the next oldest piece that we have of Carl Milles here in the collections wing, there's some on campus that date to the same time period, 1917, 1918. Think of Sun Glitter over at the Arts and Crafts Courtyard is a 19-teens sculpture that was purchased by George Booth in 1929. This is a piece that was purchased by the Cranbrook Foundation in 1934, and it is entitled The Sun Singer. And it's very much in the style of Greek and Roman sculpture. Of course, when we think about white marble Roman sculpture bust, those are very often copies of Greek originals, and the Greek originals would have been in bronze. So to see a 20th century nude with no head and no arms in the style of antiquity cast in bronze, I think Milles was actually somewhat getting even closer to the originals of Greek antiquity. And as you will learn on Saturday night during our film, which has been written and directed by yours truly, Milles did not consider himself to be a student of Rodin. He certainly wasn't a student of life or of modernity. He was a student of classical sculpture. And he actually had on campus about 100 Greek and Roman sculptures and some copies, and he would study those Greeks, and he said it was his library. So I think it's really interesting that even though his later work is much more stylistic and much more non-traditional, we do have this one 1917 piece, The Sun Singer, that really reflects his interest in classical Greek and Roman sculpture with this beautiful contrapposto pose. Now, I'm not going to go around and look at every piece, but I want to point out some of the highlights. So we've seen these two early pieces, and then we get to his immigration to America and his one and only sculpture made at Cranbrook for Cranbrook, which was Jonah and the Whale. And so this is at the end of Academy Way, at the intersection of Academy Way and Institute Way, is the full-size Jonah and the Whale. And this is a little study. And if I bring our camera closer to the whale, you can begin to see how in this bronze cast, the memory of Millis's hands are really visible. And you can see how he assembled this sculpture with clay. And on Saturday night, when you watch our documentary, you'll see photographs of Carl Millis working in clay in his Cranbrook studio, sort of pushing these little clay elements and shaping the sculpture together. Now, once he had this little version, which he probably made in his Millis house studio, he would have given it off to assistants who would have then enlarged it. They would have enlarged it by 1/3 at a time, so not quite twice as big, until he worked up to the full-size sculpture. And the way that those assistants would reproduce it, that is another Live at 5 that this sort of shelf is not quite prepared to show you, but that's a very interesting history that goes all the way back to the Greeks and Roman about how you reproduce and enlarge sculpture. But he would change the medium between clay and plaster. And so the next item that I'll show you, so that bronze casting would have been made because he made the clay study. The clay study was enlarged, and then he liked the clay study, and he would have cast it and sold it. And so it was a way of making income and a way of sort of allowing this more domestic sized Jonah and the Whale. So it was a study, an intentional study for a larger fountain, but then he also would have considered it in itself as a study, a fully completed work of art, which is why we have it here in the Art Museum. But as things increased in size, they would also change material. So here you are looking at 2 plaster studies for the Orpheus Fountain. And of course, the Orpheus Fountain is in front of the Art Museum and Library. And the figures of the Orpheus Fountain are probably 2/3 as large as this. They're slightly larger than life size and much longer than the proportions of a real human. And so this is that medium sized. After Carl Millis had made a smaller study, and we look at these studies and how little that Jonah and the Whale is, then his assistant would have mechanically enlarged that study, and Carl Millis would have again come and worked in the clay and then in the plaster in shaping these figures. And he had a plaster modeler who came over from Sweden with him in January of 1931. So it was Carl, Olga, Mrs. Millis, and the plaster man. And when the plaster gentleman, whose name is escaping me at the moment, it's terrible, when he passed away in the late 40s, Carl Millis was really quite desperate. He sort of said, I don't know how to work without my master plaster maker, because if Carl Millis was the artistic genius, it was those sort of technical jobs that allowed him to actually express his artistic genius at scale. So it's pretty cool. Now, these are really quite fragile. They're close to 100 years old from 1936. And so these are very rarely brought out on display and very rarely loaned to other museums. So I hope that you're enjoying this Live at 5 glimpse into these plaster models. And when the Art Museum reopens for Collections Wing tours, you could always email the museum and say that you were interested in being able to see some of these plasters on the tour. Of course, the Art Museum, that is up to the discretion of the visitor services and the team here, but these are pretty cool treasures stored back here in the Collections Wing. Now, this is a different fountain. Of course, all of Carl Millis's works have a certain aesthetic, so you would not be mistaken if you thought this was somewhere on campus, but it's not. It's a study for, I believe, the Meeting of the Waters fountain in St. Louis, which was Millis's most monumental and largest commission in the United States outside of Cranbrook, and it's right in front of the St. Louis train station. Now, nearby, we see another naiad, or a mythical freshwater mermaid with fish here, again from the St. Louis Commission, the Meetings of the Waters. And Millis stirred quite a bit of controversy in creating these allegories of the Mississippi River as these sort of Greek mer people, especially because they were naked, which is a controversy that followed Millis throughout his U.S. career, and he did have in Detroit what he called his fig leaf maker, because he refused to sort of give in to American Puritan values, and so he would not make the fig leaves, but he didn't contradict when fig leaves were made and put on his sculptures. I think he knew when the commission was worth it, even if in fountains like in a cemetery north of Washington, D.C., which these figures were created for, his last major U.S. work, the Fountain of Faith in Bethesda, Maryland. And at the dedication, he showed up and there were fig leaves tied around the waist of all of his naked men. So again, this is the smallest size that has been transferred from clay and then cast into bronze as its own work of art. If you head to Bethesda, you will see that these are as large as the full-size Orpheus Fountain here at Cranbrook. Now, if anything catches your eyes, do send me a little message. Sometimes Facebook can be a little contradictory about which comments it decides to actually show me, but I'll try to answer any questions that you have. These are little studies for Tritons for the St. Louis Fountain. And so, of course, Cranbrook has the Triton pools. These are continued explorations on these mythical creatures. As you'll learn on Saturday night, because surely this tour has tempted you to head over to center.cranbrook.edu and purchase a ticket to our global house party at Cranbrook and Millis Garden, our fundraiser on Saturday night. Millis had this really deep interest in classical mythology. And so many of these creatures, naiads and tritons and mermaids, not exactly sort of names you use every day, but for Millis, he was living with them every day. And so the Tritons at Cranbrook are from 1927, installed about 1935. And here in the 1930s, he was still making more Tritons, now for St. Louis. He did make other more conventional commissions, like here, Dr. Norman Tufford, a bust sculpted by Carl Millis. Now, down below, commission for a Swedish site that he received in America. And so these were carved and sculpted at Cranbrook for a Swedish city. And you're looking at two proposals for a monumental city monument. And it is of the 18th century Swedish theologian, Mr. Swedenborg, the founder of the Swedenborg religious movement. Of course, Swedenborg most famous for his treatise on heaven and hell. And so here we see a praying Swedenborg who is made out of laminated oak. And so that's a fairly unusual material for Carl Millis to work in, though there is an angel at the Cranbrook Academy of Art Library that's also made in laminated oak. And so what he's done is he's basically taken wooden boards and clamped them together with glue, and then he has carved the piece out of this giant wooden block. And we see down here Mr. Swedenborg's buckle shoes, and then around the base he has carved this sort of inscription about Mr. Swedenborg. And it says, "Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." So it's the Lord's Prayer going around the base of Swedenborg. Now, if here Mr. Swedenborg looks quite buckled up in this sort of repentant pose, he's a little bit more anguished in this version of the same commission. So like all artists, he had a client and he creates different versions of the same commission. And so here you see, I don't know if this is the conversion of Swedenborg or if this is the sort of moment where he is being enlightened as to his text. Swedenborg realized that the Last Judgment had occurred the year before in 1757, and he did create a series of sacred text. And so you see here the minister is in this much more active state, sort of reaching out, and he rests on this landscape that features one of Millis's sort of signature heads behind, and then this sort of rocky outcropping. And if I step out, it's a little hard to see because he's down on the bottom shelf, but I love the base of that version of the Swedenborg monument with this great sort of swoop of the landscape, and then Swedenborg sort of in ecstasy or agony there resting atop it. Now, there are other Millis sculptures, like in white marble, this horse, where Millis had a long interest in how to do horses and other equine animals, camels, on different bases. So one thing he taught his students here at Cranbrook was that animals shouldn't always just be on their two legs. Just because an animal stands on two legs or four legs doesn't mean that you should depict it on those four legs. And so you'll see throughout Cranbrook, in the Folkefilbeter at St. Paul, the conversion of St. Paul, the horses become very, very tiny, where all four legs are really quite tightly put together. And that was his interest in, can you make essentially a vertical equestrian statue? Why does it always have to be so wide? And then other places he becomes interested in, can a four-legged animal appear to have just one body, and can it be anchored to the earth? And particularly in the 1940s, he becomes much more interested in the sort of weight of the sculpture and the visual weight. It was something he was interested in as early as 1926 with the bull in Europa, where the bull does have four legs, but the body of the bull is perfectly flat on the ground. And so in things like this marble horse, you see the way that the horse is really depicted flat on the ground, and then his legs and things are sort of anatomically impossibly folded beneath him. But for Millis, anatomy was a sort of jumping off point for sculpture, but it didn't really dictate how a sculpture looked. And so you have figures like the Orpheus Fountain, where the anatomy has been completely stretched out, so that when you are below the Orpheus Fountain, whether in Stockholm at the National Music Hall or at Cranbrook in front of the Art Museum, do you notice how the figure now is no longer stretched out, but is appearing to have this more sort of realistic proportion? And this is the sort of angle that we would look at it. And so on Saturday night, when you see all the wonderful historic photos from Cranbrook archives of the way that Millis's sculpture studios were set up, you'll see that he had all of these amazing wheeled bases, where essentially the sculptures are on these wheels, on these elevated pedestals, and he could walk around beneath the sculpture. So even if the Orpheus maquette is at 2/3 smaller than it would be, he's looking at it as if it is a huge piece of sculpture. And that was very important to be able to get the proportions right. Now, I'll just talk about a couple of other pieces. Again, if you have questions, do feel free to type them in. We have this wonderful another wooden laminated block sculpture of the man and unicorn here from about 1930. And then I thought it would be fun if those of you who have been around Cranbrook long enough might recognize these pieces. These are the missing parts of the Triton pools. And so this is the Battle of the Tritons, and then the Swimming Triton. And you'll notice that she might be a mermaid, and there's another Triton behind. You notice that she is a different color. So at a certain point, one of these figures was actually removed from the Triton pools against the will of Cranbrook. So because it was stolen, these smaller pieces were brought inside for safekeeping, and they await reinstallation once we figured out a way to get them mounted correctly and safely back. Now, the remaining Millis pieces that I wanted to show us, the Struggle of Genius here, which is another plaster model. And it's actually kind of interesting that this one has the fig leaf in the plaster model, because as I was preparing for today's Live at 5, I was trying to figure out where the struggle for genius came from. And there is a copy at Millis Garden. There's also 3 copies here in the U.S. And there was a piece in the U.S. about, can we put up this naked genius in the city square? That was an article from 2018 or something. So it's interesting that here he is a more modest genius. But this shows the sort of skill and craftsmanship of the plaster maker, because you see here where his arm goes, and then you can see down below the arms are back there. And so you really have to be an absolute expert in the art of mold making and casting in order to figure out how to take Millis's clay maquette and then turn it into something that the principles of plaster casting and shrinkage and scaling and then fitting it together. It is a distinct art form all to itself. I know in college I took a class on mold making and casting, and I'm not an expert mold maker or caster, but I certainly have an enormous amount of respect to the difficulty of creating something this large that then slots together and pieces together. And then for, I think it was Sharon, who said she's watching from St. Louis. Here is another one of the Meeting of the Waters mermaid with fishes. And so this is, again, very similar to other sculptures we have at Cranbrook, but this one sculpted at Cranbrook for Merrick Rogers, the curator at the St. Louis Art Museum, who was integral in publishing both the Yale University Press monograph about Carl Millis, which introduced him to many American audiences, and also Merrick Rogers was integral in having the Meeting of the Waters fountain in St. Louis greenlit and then funded and maintained by the city. And all sorts of other fun sketches here, like Sunday morning in deep waters with these sort of wonderful children crawling across it. So this is our intimate look at Carl Millis in the collections wing of Cranbrook Art Museum. Now, we're focused just on the bigger pieces, but Cranbrook also has plaques. We also have a collection of coins designed by Carl Millis. We also have a number of drawings by Carl and Olga in the Cranbrook Art Museum collection. And then we also have drawings, sketches, and letters in the Cranbrook Archives collections. These wonderful fish, which were a gift to Cranbrook Art Museum by the Academy graduate and longtime secretary Marguerite Kimball, and these fish that sort of plug in to different sculptures. And so there's so much more to learn about Carl Millis, and I want to again invite you all to the upcoming fundraiser on the evening of Saturday, May 22nd. That's this evening. It kicks off at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. We're going to have a number of things that happen first. There'll be a live auction where you can bid on a carefully curated selection of experiences and items related to Carl Millis and to Sweden and Cranbrook. Then we'll have an ambassador with the with the Swedish ambassador to the United States, Her Excellency Karin Olofsdotter. And then we'll, after the interview with Her Excellency Karin, we will experience 25 minutes of magical Carl Millis in a Kevin Adkisson original documentary about Carl Millis. After that, there's about a 15-minute documentary about Millis Garden. And what I should say about those documentaries is that they are all new productions of new footage, high-resolution drone footage, as well as camera work. You saw 2 weeks ago that we were filming for the show, as well as just hundreds of rich, beautiful, rarely seen, recently digitized historic photographs. Is it the Ken Burns 6-part special on Carl Millis? No. But is it going to be an hour and a half long evening to celebrate Cranbrook's most eminent Swedish sculptor? Yes. And I know that you will learn things, and I know that you will enjoy them. So it's not the end-all be-all Carl Millis documentary. I'll save that for my midlife career retrospective. But this is really, I think, a very emotional, a very beautiful symphony of bronze. So I encourage all of you to head over to center.cranbrook.edu to purchase your tickets to a global house party at Cranbrook and Millis Garden. Tickets start at just $50, and it is our fundraiser. So I know that $50 ticket price might be a little higher than what you're used to go to an event at Cranbrook or another museum. But remember that it's through this fundraiser that I'm able to keep my job, and the center is able to keep on preserving and sharing the treasures of Cranbrook with generations of future viewers and students and visitors from around the world. So I say keep my job jokingly. Really what you are supporting with the fundraiser is the ongoing maintenance of our historic houses, our historic sculpture, the ongoing work of Cranbrook Archives, and really everything we do at the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research to share the story of art, education, and science with others. Now, I came over to Orpheus here, just as a last piece on our whirlwind trip through the collections wing of Carl Milles, because Orpheus is from 1926, and in 1929 he was installed on the column in the Maya Grotel courtyard, the arts and crafts courtyard. And I love this Orpheus maquette because he's just so powerful, these sort of sinuous muscles that are sort of cascading around, and then he is strumming his lyre with the implied strings up above, and he would have looked down at generations of Academy students and artists at work in the arts and crafts courtyard. Now, one day we hope to have him reinstalled on that column in the courtyard. The problem with the column is that it is actually about 1,800 years old, and it can no longer support the weight and the acid rain of this sculpture. So we need to recast the column capital, and then we can get Orpheus back on his column. Now you may be thinking, Orpheus Fountain. This sculpture is actually a full decade older than the Orpheus Fountain. And so the Orpheus that is not at Cranbrook, he is in Stockholm. He is surrounded by those figures being awakened by his music on the lyre. But there is this 10-year gap between when Carl Milles sculpted Orpheus to when the Swedish National Concert Hall asked for a giant Orpheus to be placed in front of the new concert hall, and Milles decided to add those 8 figures around the base. At Cranbrook, we did not install a giant Orpheus because in Stockholm, the Orpheus is close to 36 feet tall, and the columns of the museum are not actually even, here at Cranbrook, are not even 40 feet. And so Saarinen, George Booth, and Milles sort of thought, we'll keep our little Orpheus, but we won't add that huge Orpheus. We'll instead just take the figures, and so that's what we have at Cranbrook. Now, as I've been walking around, you've seen work from alumni artists all around me. I don't want to give away too many secrets because coming up in June, mid-June, we will be opening a landmark show with Eyes Opened, a history of Cranbrook Academy of Art. And so what you're seeing is all types of student artwork and alumni artwork that is being prepared by the team at the Art Museum for the show. Thanks so much for joining me for another Live at 5. I hope to see many of you virtually on Saturday night. It is a fully produced event. There will not be a live portion, so it's a pretty high budget little evening if you're used to my handheld camera of Live at 5. I think you're really going to be delighted. So it would mean a lot to me if you head over to center.cranbrook.edu and sign up for our fundraiser, a global house party at Cranbrook and Milles Garden. I know that you're going to enjoy it. Until next Wednesday, I will not. You're all signing up right now for a global house party at Cranbrook and Milles Garden. Until next time, Kevin Adkisson with the Center for Collections and Research. And thank you to the Art Museum for allowing me to be here today and share so many of these wonderful treasures from the Cranbrook Art Museum collection. Goodbye.